Margaret Chun had worked at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center for 37 years, and in all that time, she had perfected the art of being invisible. Not the kind of invisible that came from hiding or avoiding people, but the quiet, steady invisibility of someone who simply did their job well without seeking attention or praise. Every morning at 5:30, Margaret's alarm would sound in her small apartment just 15 minutes from the hospital. She never hit the snooze button, never needed to. Her internal clock had been set to this rhythm for decades, and her body knew exactly when it was time to rise. She would shower quickly, dress in her standard uniform of navy blue scrubs and white sneakers, and eat a simple breakfast of toast and coffee while listening to the morning news. By 6:45, Margaret was walking through the employee entrance of Walter Reed, her ID badge swinging gently from the retractable cord clipped to her pocket. The security guards knew her by name, though she had never made any effort to befriend them. They simply recognized her as a fixture of the place, like the marble floors or the American flag that hung in the main lobby. Margaret worked in environmental services, which was a polite way of saying she was part of the cleaning crew. But to call her simply a cleaner would be like calling a master chef simply someone who heated up food. Margaret had turned the maintenance of her assigned floors into something approaching an art form. She knew every corner, every surface, every piece of equipment in the 3 floors she was responsible for maintaining. The 7th, 8th, and 9th floors housed some of the hospital's most critical care units. The trauma surgery recovery ward, the intensive care unit, and the long-term rehabilitation center where wounded soldiers learned to walk again, to use artificial limbs, to live with injuries that would have been fatal just a generation earlier. In these floors, cleanliness was not just about appearance. It was about life and death. Infections could kill a patient who had survived an IED blast in Afghanistan. A single oversight in sanitization could turn a healing environment into a dangerous one. Margaret understood this in a way that went beyond any training manual or hospital protocol. She had her own system developed over years of careful observation and continuous improvement. While other members of the environmental services team followed the standard checklist, Margaret had created her own expanded version. She knew which disinfectants worked best on which surfaces. She understood the flow patterns of the medical staff and timed her work to minimize disruptions while maximizing efficiency. The medical equipment required special attention. Heart monitors, ventilators for stands, and the dozens of other machines that kept patients alive needed to be cleaned with particular care. Too aggressive, and she might damage sensitive components. Too gentle, and dangerous bacteria could survive to threaten vulnerable patients. Margaret had learned to read these machines almost like a technician, understanding which parts could handle stronger disinfectants and which required the gentlest touch. But it was not just the technical aspects of her work that set Margaret apart. She had developed an almost supernatural awareness of the human ecosystem that existed within these floors. She knew which nurses worked which shifts, which doctors prefer their workstations arranged in particular ways, which staff members were having difficult days, and might benefit from finding their workspace a little extra organized when they returned from a break. Margaret observed everything and remembered everything. She noticed when Dr. Patricia Williams, the head of trauma surgery, started drinking more coffee than usual and recognized it as a sign that the doctor was dealing with a particularly challenging caseload. She saw when Nurse Rodriguez's hands shook slightly as he prepared medications and understood that he was still processing the loss of a patient from the week before. She watched the family members who spent days and nights in the waiting areas, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, surviving on vending machine food and hospital coffee. Margaret saw the wives who tried to stay strong for their wounded husbands, the parents who aged years in the span of days while waiting for news about their injured children, the children who tried to understand why their father or mother looked so different now. These observations informed Margaret's work in ways that would have surprised anyone who bothered to pay attention. She made sure that the family waiting areas were always spotless and comfortable. She ensured that the vending machines were wiped down frequently, knowing that stressed family members often ate mindlessly and deserved clean surfaces. She paid special attention to the windows in patient rooms, understanding that for someone confined to a bed, the view outside might be their only connection to the world beyond their pain. Margaret's relationship with the medical staff was professional but warm. The doctors and nurses knew her as reliable and unobtrusive. They appreciated that she could clean around them while they worked without getting in the way or creating distractions. When they needed something, Margaret often anticipated the request before it was made. Dr. Sarah Kim, a young resident in trauma surgery, had once been amazed to find that Margaret had already moved extra chairs into a patient room where a large family was gathering to say goodbye to their loved one. The resident had been trying to figure out how to accommodate everyone when she discovered that Margaret had quietly assessed the situation and made the necessary arrangements. "How did you know?" Dr. Kim had asked. Margaret had simply shrugged. "You could see they needed the space," she had replied, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. But perhaps Margaret's most remarkable quality was her ability to interact with the patients themselves. Hospital policy required environmental services staff to be respectful, but minimal in their interactions with patients. They were supposed to clean efficiently and quietly to avoid disturbing people who were dealing with serious medical issues. Margaret followed this policy, but she had developed her own way of bending it slightly without breaking it. She had learned to read the moods and needs of the patients she encountered during her work. Some wanted complete privacy and silence. Others seemed desperate for any human contact that did not involve medical procedures or discussions of their injuries. For the patients who seemed open to interaction, Margaret had perfected a gentle, encouraging presence. She never stayed long or engaged in extensive conversations, but she had a way of making people feel seen and valued during the brief moments when their paths crossed. Private Jackson Williams had been recovering from severe burns on his arms and face when Margaret first encountered him. He was young, maybe 22, and clearly struggling with depression and anger about his injuries. The first few times Margaret cleaned his room, he barely acknowledged her presence, staring at the ceiling or out the window with the expression of profound sadness. Margaret did not try to force conversation, but she paid attention to small details that might make his day slightly better. She noticed that he seemed to prefer the blinds adjusted to let in indirect light rather than full sunshine. She observed that he liked his water pitcher filled completely and positioned on his right side where his less injured arm could reach it easily. One day, while Margaret was cleaning his bathroom, she heard Jackson crying softly. She continued her work quietly, giving him privacy while staying within earshot in case he needed help. When she emerged from the bathroom, she saw that he had knocked over his water pitcher trying to reach for tissues, soaking his bedside table and some personal items. Without saying a word, Margaret quickly cleaned up the spilled water and gently dried off the items that had gotten wet. Among them was a photograph of Jackson with a young woman, both of them smiling and wearing graduation caps. The photo had gotten soaked, and Margaret could see the panic in Jackson's eyes as he realized his precious memory might be ruined. Margaret carefully examined the photograph, then looked at Jackson with a reassuring smile. "This will be fine," she told him quietly. "Just needs to air dry properly. I'll put it somewhere safe." She placed the photo on a clean towel on the windowsill, positioning it so that it would dry evenly without being damaged by direct sunlight. Then she refilled his water pitcher and positioned it exactly where he could reach it easily. "Your girlfriend?" Margaret asked gently, nodding toward the photo. Jackson nodded, his eyes filling with tears again. "Fiancé," he said quietly. She's coming to visit next week. I don't know if she'll still want to marry me looking like this." Margaret considered this for a moment, then spoke with quiet conviction. "A woman who loves you enough to say yes to marriage? She's not going to change her mind because of some scars. She'll be worried about you, not worried about how you look." Jackson looked at her with surprise, as if he had not expected such direct wisdom from someone he had barely noticed before. Margaret finished her work efficiently and left the room, but she made sure to check on the photograph each day until it was completely dry and could be safely returned to Jackson. Word of Margaret's small kindnesses spread quietly through the hospital floors she serviced, not through gossip or formal recognition, but through the subtle network of appreciation that develops in any workplace where someone consistently goes above and beyond their basic responsibilities. The nurses began to notice that patient rooms seemed more comfortable and organized after Margaret had been there. The doctors observed that their workstations were always optimized for efficiency, with supplies positioned exactly where they were most useful. The patients themselves, when asked about their hospital experience, often mentioned feeling cared for in ways they could not quite articulate. Margaret never sought credit for these improvements. When complimented on her work, she would simply nod and say something like, "Just doing my job," or "That's what anyone would do." She seemed genuinely unaware that her approach to her responsibilities was anything special or noteworthy. Her supervisor, Mr. Rodriguez, had tried multiple times over the years to nominate Margaret for various recognition programs. The hospital had awards for outstanding service, employee appreciation ceremonies, and opportunities for advancement to supervisory positions. Margaret had politely declined all of these suggestions. "I like my work," she would tell Mr. Rodriguez. "I don't need awards or new titles. I just want to keep doing what I'm doing." Mr. Rodriguez respected her wishes, but he often wondered how someone could be so talented and dedicated while remaining so uninterested in recognition or advancement. Margaret seemed content with the simple satisfaction of doing her job well and knowing that her work mattered. The truth was that Margaret had found her purpose in these hospital floors. She had discovered that she possessed a rare combination of technical skill, emotional intelligence, and genuine care for others that made her exceptionally good at creating healing environments. She understood that her work was not just about cleaning surfaces, but about maintaining spaces where people could recover, heal, and hope. Every day brought new challenges and opportunities to make a difference. A patient struggling with pain who needed extra attention to their comfort. A family dealing with devastating news who could benefit from a clean, organized space to process their grief. A medical team working under pressure who deserved to have their workspace optimized for success. Margaret approached each of these situations with the same quiet competence and genuine care that had defined her approach to everything for 37 years. She continued to arrive early, work diligently, and go home each evening with the satisfaction of knowing she had contributed to something important. She had no way of knowing that her decades of faithful, excellent service were about to be recognized in a way that would surprise everyone, including herself. The events that would soon unfold would prove that sometimes the most remarkable people are those who never try to be remarkable at all. In her small apartment that evening, Margaret prepared her simple dinner and laid out her clothes for the next day, just as she had done thousands of times before. Tomorrow would bring new patients to care for, new challenges to meet, and new opportunities to serve. She looked forward to it with the same quiet satisfaction that had sustained her for nearly 4 decades of service. Margaret Shin slept well that night, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The morning of October 15th started like any other for Margaret Shin. Her alarm sounded at 5:30. She rose without hesitation and went through her established routine of shower, breakfast, and news. The weather report promised a crisp autumn day, and Margaret selected a light cardigan to wear under her scrubs, knowing that the hospital could get cold in the early morning hours. What Margaret did not know was that 3 floors above her usual workspace, preparations were already underway for an unprecedented visit. General Robert Harrison, a 4-star general and the highest-ranking officer in the U.S. Army Medical Command, was scheduled to tour Walter Reed National Military Medical Center that day. This was not a routine inspection or a ceremonial visit. General Harrison was conducting a comprehensive review of military medical facilities across the country, and Walter Reed was his final stop. The general's reputation preceded him. A decorated combat veteran with tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, General Harrison had earned respect not just for his military leadership, but for his genuine concern for the soldiers under his command. Stories circulated about his habit of visiting wounded soldiers personally, his advocacy for improved military medical care, and his insistence that every person who served deserved the highest quality treatment available. Hospital administrators had been preparing for this visit for weeks. Every department had been briefed, every protocol reviewed, every surface polished to perfection. The visit was scheduled to include tours of the major medical units, meetings with department heads, and discussions about current challenges and future improvements in military medical care. Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of trauma surgery, had spent considerable time preparing her presentation about the advances in battlefield medicine that had saved thousands of lives over the past decade. Nurse manager Janet Foster had organized her staff to ensure that patient care would continue seamlessly during the general's visit while still allowing him to observe their work. Even the cafeteria had prepared special meals to accommodate the general's dietary requirements. What none of these preparations had taken into account was Margaret Shun. Environmental services staff were not included in the briefings about the general's visit. Their role was simply to ensure that everything was clean and ready, which they did every day regardless of whether important visitors were coming. Margaret arrived at work that Tuesday morning and immediately noticed the subtle signs that something special was happening. There were more security personnel than usual in the lobby. Several staff members she recognized were dressed more formally than typical. The hospital's public relations coordinator was walking through the hallways with a clipboard, making notes about lighting and camera angles. But Margaret's routine remained unchanged. She signed in at the environmental services office, collected her supplies, and took the elevator to the 7th floor to begin her work. As she pushed her cart down the hallway, she could sense the heightened energy in the building, but it did not affect her approach to her responsibilities. The 7th floor housed the trauma surgery recovery unit, where patients who had undergone emergency operations were taken for initial stabilization and monitoring. It was often the first place that wounded soldiers would regain consciousness after life-saving surgery, and the atmosphere was always intense with a mixture of hope, fear, and determination that characterized these critical early days of recovery. Margaret began her work in the family waiting area, knowing from experience that this space would need extra attention. Families often spend entire days here, and the stress of waiting for news about their loved ones led to spilled coffee, scattered tissues, and the accumulated where that came from people sitting in the same chairs for hours at a time. As she worked, Margaret became aware of unusual activity in the hallway. Medical staff were moving with more purpose than usual, and she could hear the quiet conversations of people preparing for something important. Margaret continued her work, staying out of the way while ensuring that everything met her own high standards for cleanliness and organization. It was while she was carefully cleaning the windows in the waiting area that Margaret first heard about the visit from Nurse Rodriguez, who stopped to check on one of his patients. "Big day today," he mentioned his colleague as they passed through the waiting area. "Four-star general is touring the hospital. First time we've had someone that high-ranking visit in person." Margaret absorbed this information quietly while continuing her work. She had cleaned these floors during visits from congressmen, military officials, and even a former Secretary of Defense. Her approach never changed. Important visitors or not, patients deserve the same level of care and attention to their environment. She moved methodically through her assigned areas, paying special attention to details that might be overlooked during the heightened activity of the day. Patient room bathrooms received extra scrutiny. Medical equipment was cleaned with particular care. Family spaces were organized to provide maximum comfort for people dealing with stress and uncertainty. In room 734, Margaret encountered Staff Sergeant David Kumar, a 28-year-old soldier who had lost his right leg below the knee in an IED explosion 3 weeks earlier. David was one of the patients Margaret had been observing closely, not because of any official assignment, but because she had recognized the signs of someone struggling with depression and anger about his situation. David was a proud man who had defined himself through his physical capabilities. He had been a marathon runner before his deployment, and the loss of his leg represented not just a physical injury, but a fundamental challenge to his identity and his plans for the future. Margaret had watched him go through the stages of grief, anger, and gradual acceptance that many patients experienced, but David seemed stuck in the anger phase. "Morning, Sergeant Kumar," Margaret said quietly as she entered his room to clean. She had learned all her patients' names and ranks, understanding that being addressed properly was important for maintaining dignity during vulnerable times. David looked up from the physical therapy exercises he had been attempting with his remaining leg. His face showed the frustration and exhaustion that had become familiar to Margaret over the past few weeks. "Morning, Mrs. Chun," he replied, using the formal address that Margaret preferred. Most patients simply called her Margaret, but David had maintained military courtesy in their interactions, which Margaret appreciated as a sign of mutual respect. Margaret began her cleaning routine, but she could sense that David wanted to talk. Over the weeks of their brief daily interactions, she had learned to read his moods and recognize when he needed someone to listen. "They're telling me I might be able to run again," David said, his voice mixing hope and skepticism. "With the new prosthetics, they say some people even compete in marathons." Margaret continued her work while listening, understanding that David needed to process these thoughts aloud. "That sounds encouraging," she replied carefully. "But what if I can't?" David continued. "What if I'm never the same? What if I can't do the things that made me who I am?" Margaret paused in her cleaning and looked at David directly. In her 37 years at the hospital, she had heard variations of this question from hundreds of patients. Each person's situation was unique, but the underlying fear was always the same: the terror that injury or illness had fundamentally changed who they were as people. "Sergeant Kumar," Margaret said gently, "in all my years working here, I've learned that the things that make you who you are don't come from what your body can do. They come from what your heart and mind choose to do." David looked at her with surprise. This was the most personal thing Margaret had ever said to him, and her words carried the weight of decades of observation and experience. "I've seen soldiers like you face challenges that seemed impossible," Margaret continued. "Some of them do learn to run again. Others find completely different ways to be strong and capable. But the ones who do best are the ones who understand that courage and character don't depend on having all your original parts." Before David could respond, they were interrupted by commotion in the hallway. Margaret could hear the distinctive sound of a large group moving through the hospital with purpose and authority. David looked toward his door with curiosity. "Sounds like something important happening," he observed. Margaret nodded and returned to her cleaning, but she was also listening to the sounds in the hallway. She recognized the pattern of a formal visit: the slightly faster pace of staff members, the quiet but urgent conversations, the sound of dress shoes instead of the usual soft-soled footwear worn by medical personnel. A few minutes later, Nurse Rodriguez appeared in David's doorway. "Sergeant Kumar," he said formally, "we have a very special visitor in the hospital today. General Harrison is touring the facility, and he's asked to meet with some of our recovering soldiers, if you're willing." David's expression immediately changed. Margaret could see the mixture of honor and nervousness that crossed his face. Meeting with a four-star general was not something that happened to most soldiers, even during their entire careers. "Of course," David replied, immediately trying to sit up straighter in his bed. "I'd be honored to meet with the general." Nurse Rodriguez smiled. "He'll be here in about 15 minutes. Is there anything you need to prepare?" David looked around his room, suddenly conscious of its appearance in a way he had not been before. Margaret quietly continued her work, but she was also making small adjustments to ensure that everything in David's room met the highest possible standards. After Nurse Rodriguez left, David turned to Margaret with a nervous expression. "Mrs. Chun, do I look okay? Is my room ready for a general?" Margaret looked at David with the same careful attention she gave to every detail of her work. His hair needed combing, his hospital gown could be adjusted for better appearance, and his bedside table could be organized more neatly. "Let me help," Margaret said simply. She quickly finished her official cleaning tasks, then turned her attention to helping David prepare for his important visitor. She handed him a comb and held up the small mirror from his bedside table so he could see to groom himself properly. She straightened his hospital gown and adjusted his blankets so that he looked dignified and comfortable. Margaret organized David's bedside table, positioning his water pitcher, phone, and personal items in a way that looked neat but natural. She adjusted the blinds to provide the best lighting for conversation. In less than 5 minutes, she had transformed David's room from a standard patient space into something that looked ready for an important meeting. "Thank you," David said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." Margaret was about to respond when they heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway growing closer. The visit was beginning, and Margaret needed to finish her work and move out of the way so that the general could meet with David privately. But as she gathered her cleaning supplies to leave the room, Margaret realized that the footsteps had stopped right outside David's door. She could hear quiet conversation and then Nurse Rodriguez's voice saying, "This is Staff Sergeant Kumar's room, sir." Margaret quickly moved toward the door, intending to slip out and continue her work elsewhere while the meeting took place. But as she reached the doorway, she found herself face to face with a tall man in dress military uniform with 4 stars on his collar. General Robert Harrison was exactly what Margaret would have expected a 4-star general to look like. He was imposing and authoritative, but his eyes held the warmth and intelligence that had made him respected throughout the military. He was accompanied by 2 aides-de-camp and the hospital's chief administrator, Dr. Richardson. Margaret immediately stepped aside to allow the general and his entourage to enter David's room, but General Harrison paused and looked at her with curiosity. "And you are?" he asked politely. Margaret was momentarily flustered. She had been working to remain invisible during this important visit, and being directly addressed by a 4-star general was not something she had ever experienced or expected. "Margaret Chun, sir," she replied. "Environmental Services." General Harrison nodded thoughtfully, then looked past Margaret into David's room. Margaret could see him taking in the perfect organization, the optimal lighting, the sense that everything had been arranged with careful attention to both comfort and dignity. "This room looks excellent," General Harrison observed to Dr. Richardson. "Your staff clearly takes great pride in maintaining proper standards." Dr. Richardson followed the general's gaze and seemed to notice for the first time how perfectly arranged David's room appeared. His eyes moved from the room to Margaret, and she could see him beginning to understand that this was not the standard appearance of a patient room. Margaret quietly excused herself and moved down the hallway to continue her work, leaving the general to his important meeting with David. But she could not shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred, even though she could not quite identify what it was. As she worked in the next patient room, Margaret could hear the sounds of conversation from David's room. The meeting seemed to be going well, with periods of laughter and what sounded like animated discussion. Margaret felt satisfied that she had been able to help David make a good impression during this important encounter. What Margaret did not know was that General Harrison was asking David detailed questions about his experience at Walter Reed, including questions about the quality of care, the cleanliness and organization of the facility, and the attitude and competence of the staff members he had encountered. David was providing enthusiastic answers about the medical care he had received, but he was also telling the general about Margaret Chun and her extraordinary attention to detail and personal care for patients. As the conversation continued, General Harrison was beginning to understand that something special had just occurred in his brief interaction with the woman in the hallway. The visit continued, but General Harrison found himself thinking about the perfectly arranged patient room and the quiet woman who had made it possible. There was something about the encounter that suggested he had witnessed just a small example of something much larger and more important. General Harrison's conversation with Staff Sergeant David Kumar lasted nearly 30 minutes, much longer than anyone had anticipated. What had started as a brief courtesy visit had evolved into a detailed discussion about David's recovery, his plans for the future, and his overall experience at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. David spoke enthusiastically about the medical care he had received, praising the skill and dedication of his doctors and nurses. But what caught General Harrison's attention was David's repeated references to Margaret Chun and the extraordinary level of personal attention she provided to patients. "She's not just cleaning rooms, sir," David explained to the general. "She's creating an environment where people can heal. She knows exactly what each patient needs, often before they know it themselves. She turned my room into a place that felt like home instead of just another hospital room." General Harrison listened intently as David described specific examples of Margaret's care. How she had positioned his personal items for easy access, how she adjusted lighting based on his preferences, how she had helped to prepare for this very meeting. David also mentioned the photograph incident, explaining how Margaret had carefully preserved his water-damaged picture and provided exactly the encouragement he needed during a moment of despair. "In the military, sir, we talk about going above and beyond the call of duty," David continued. "Mrs. Chun does that every single day, but she does it so quietly that most people probably don't even notice. She's been a huge part of my recovery, and I don't think she has any idea how much difference she's made." General Harrison found himself increasingly intrigued by this description. In his decades of military service, he had learned to recognize exceptional performance, whether it came from soldiers on the battlefield or civilians supporting the military mission. David's account suggested that Margaret Chun represented exactly the kind of dedicated service that made military medical care possible. When the meeting concluded, General Harrison thanked David for his service and wished him well in his recovery. But as he left the room, he found himself looking down the hallway for Margaret Chun. She was visible in the distance, methodically working her way through patient rooms with the same careful attention to detail that had been evident in David's room. Dr. Richardson, the hospital administrator, noticed the general's interest. "Is there something specific you'd like to see, General Harrison?" he asked. "Tell me about Margaret Chun," General Harrison replied. "How long has she worked here? What kind of training does she have? Who supervises her work?" Dr. Richardson looked surprised by the questions. Environmental services staff were rarely the focus of high-level attention during important visits. "I believe she's been here quite a long time," he replied. "I can get you specific information if you're interested." "I am interested," General Harrison said firmly. "Very interested." As the tour continued through the other floors and departments of Walter Reed, General Harrison maintained his professional focus on the presentations and meetings that had been planned. He met with department heads, reviewed statistics about patient outcomes, and discussed budget allocations and resource needs. But part of his attention remained focused on Margaret Chun and the questions her work had raised about the often overlooked aspects of military medical care. During lunch with the hospital's senior leadership, General Harrison steered the conversation toward support staff and their role in patient care. Dr. Williams, the chief of trauma surgery, spoke enthusiastically about the importance of the entire healthcare team, including housekeeping, food service, and administrative personnel. "The reality is that healing happens in an environment, not just in an operating room," Dr. Williams explained. "When patients feel safe, comfortable, and cared for in every aspect of their experience, their medical outcomes improve. We've seen this repeatedly in our data." General Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Do you have specific examples of support staff who exemplify that kind of comprehensive care?" Dr. Williams immediately thought of Margaret Chun. "Actually, yes. There's a woman in environmental services who has become legendary among our medical staff. Margaret Chun. She's been here for decades, and she has an almost supernatural ability to create healing environments. Patients consistently mention her in their feedback, even though her job description doesn't include direct patient interaction. Nurse manager Janet Foster, who was also present at lunch, added her own observations. Margaret understands that her work isn't just about cleaning surfaces. She's maintaining spaces where people are dealing with the most challenging experiences of their lives. She approaches that responsibility with incredible dedication and skill. General Harrison listened to these descriptions with growing conviction that Margaret Chin represented something important that was often missing from discussions about healthcare quality. Military medical facilities focused extensively on medical protocols, equipment, and clinical outcomes. But the human environment in which healing occurred was equally critical, and it seemed that Margaret had mastered this aspect of healthcare in ways that deserved recognition. After lunch, General Harrison made an unusual request. Instead of continuing with the planned tour, he asked to spend time observing the daily operations of the Environmental Services Department. Dr. Richardson was clearly surprised by this request, but he quickly arranged for the general to meet with Mr. Rodriguez, Margaret's supervisor. Mr. Rodriguez had supervised environmental services at Walter Reed for 15 years, and he had never been asked to brief a four-star general about his department's operations. He was nervous, but eager to showcase the professionalism and dedication of his staff. General Harrison, Mr. Rodriguez began, "Our department is responsible for maintaining the cleanliness and safety of this entire facility. We work around the clock to ensure that every surface, every room, and every piece of equipment meets the highest standards for infection control and patient safety." General Harrison nodded, but his questions focused specifically on Margaret Chin. "Tell me about Margaret's performance. How does she compare to other members of your staff?" Mr. Rodriguez's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Sir, Margaret Chin is simply the best employee I have ever supervised. In 15 years of management, I have never encountered anyone who approaches their work with her level of skill, dedication, and genuine care for the mission." Mr. Rodriguez went on to explain Margaret's expanded cleaning protocols, her proactive approach to patient and staff needs, and her remarkable ability to work efficiently without disrupting medical operations. He described how other environmental services staff looked to Margaret as an informal mentor and how medical personnel specifically requested that Margaret be assigned to their areas when possible. "I've tried multiple times to promote Margaret or get her additional recognition," Mr. Rodriguez continued. "She consistently declines. She says she just wants to do her job well. But honestly, General, her job performance is so far above standard expectations that she's essentially functioning at a supervisory level while maintaining the hands-on work she loves." General Harrison asked to see Margaret's personnel file, including her performance evaluations, training records, and any commendation she had received. What he discovered was a remarkable record of consistent excellence spanning nearly 4 decades. Margaret's performance evaluations were uniformly outstanding, with comments from supervisors praising her reliability, attention to detail, and positive impact on both patient satisfaction and staff morale. Her training record showed that she had voluntarily completed additional courses in infection control, patient safety, and medical equipment maintenance, far beyond what was required for her position. Most surprisingly, Margaret's file contained numerous commendation letters from patients, family members, and medical staff. These letters, spanning many years, told consistent stories of extraordinary service that went far beyond basic job requirements. Patients wrote about feeling cared for and valued during their most vulnerable moments. Family members expressed gratitude for Margaret's attention to their comfort during long, stressful hospital stays. Medical staff praise her ability to anticipate their needs and create optimal working conditions. Has Margaret ever been formally recognized for this level of service? General Harrison asked. Mr. Rodriguez looked embarrassed. "Sir, we've tried. She's been nominated for Employee of the Month, Employee of the Year, and several hospital-wide recognition programs. She always declines to participate. She says she doesn't want the attention, that she just wants to focus on her work." General Harrison studied Margaret's file for several more minutes. reading through the specific examples of her service and the impact she had made on thousands of patients over her career. He was beginning to understand that he had encountered something rare and valuable, a person who had achieved mastery in their field while remaining completely focused on service rather than recognition. "I'd like to observe Margaret's work directly," General Harrison told Mr. Rodriguez. "Can that be arranged without disrupting her routine?" Mr. Rodriguez looked uncertain. "Sir, Margaret is very private about her work. She might be uncomfortable being observed by such a high-ranking official." General Harrison considered this. "Then, let's observe from a distance. I want to see how she actually approaches her responsibilities." For the next hour, General Harrison and a small group of hospital administrators quietly observed Margaret's work from strategic positions that allowed them to watch without interfering. What they saw confirmed everything that had been described in the meetings and personnel files. Margaret moved through her assigned areas with remarkable efficiency and attention to detail. But more impressive than her technical skills was her ability to read and respond to the human environment around her. She adjusted her timing and approach based on the activity levels of medical staff. She made small, but meaningful improvements to patient room arrangements. She interacted briefly, but warmly with patients who seemed open to conversation while respecting the privacy of those who preferred solitude. In one patient room, they watched Margaret notice that an elderly veteran was struggling to reach his water pitcher. Without being asked, she quietly repositioned it within easy reach. In another room, she observed that a patient's family photos had been knocked over and carefully straightened them, taking a moment to ensure they were positioned where the patient could see them clearly from his bed. Throughout all of this, Margaret maintained the same quiet, professional demeanor that had characterized her work for decades. She seemed completely unaware that she was being observed by some of the highest-ranking officials in military medicine. General Harrison was impressed, but he was also beginning to formulate a plan. In his years of military leadership, he had learned that exceptional performance should be recognized and used as an example to inspire others. Margaret Chin's approach to her work embodied the values of service, excellence, and dedication that the military sought to instill in all of its personnel. But he also understood, based on what he had learned about Margaret's personality, that traditional forms of recognition might not be appropriate or welcome. She had consistently declined formal awards and promotions, preferring to focus on her work rather than receiving attention for it. General Harrison decided that Margaret Chin deserved recognition, but it would need to be recognition that honored her values and her approach to service. It would need to acknowledge her contribution in a way that felt authentic to who she was and what she represented. As the afternoon progressed and General Harrison's visit neared its end, he found himself thinking about the broader implications of what he had observed. Military medical care was evaluated primarily through clinical metrics, survival rates, infection rates, length of stay, and readiness for return to duty. These were important measures, but they did not capture the full impact of the healing environment that people like Margaret created. General Harrison began to see Margaret as representing a crucial but undervalued aspect of military health care. Her work demonstrated that recovery and healing were influenced by much more than medical procedures and medications. They were influenced by the sense of dignity, comfort, and care that patients experience throughout their stay. The general's visit was scheduled to conclude with a brief ceremony in the hospital's main auditorium, where he would address the assembled medical staff and thank them for their service to wounded military personnel. But General Harrison had decided to make an addition to the program. He was going to ensure that Margaret Chin received the recognition she deserved, whether she wanted it or not. And he was going to do it in a way that would honor her service while demonstrating to everyone present what true dedication to the military mission looked like. As the day moved toward its conclusion, Margaret continued her work, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined. The quiet woman who had spent 37 years serving others without seeking recognition was about to discover that sometimes extraordinary service cannot remain hidden. no matter how humble the person providing it. As the afternoon moved toward evening, Margaret Shun continued her methodical work through the floors of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, completely unaware of the discussions that had been taking place about her throughout the day. She finished her assigned areas on the 7th floor and moved to the 8th floor, where the intensive care unit housed the hospital's most critically injured patients. The ICU required a different approach than the regular patient floors. The atmosphere was more intense, the medical equipment more complex, and the families more stressed. Margaret had developed specialized techniques for working in this environment over the years, understanding that even small disruptions could have serious consequences for patients whose conditions were unstable. As Margaret began her work in the ICU family waiting area, she noticed Mrs. Patricia Santos, whose son Miguel had been brought to Walter Reed 3 days earlier after suffering severe injuries in a training accident. Mrs. Santos had barely left the hospital since her son's arrival, sleeping fitfully in waiting room chairs and surviving on coffee and the occasional sandwich from the hospital cafeteria. Margaret had been observing Mrs. Santos carefully, recognizing the signs of a family member under extreme stress. The woman was clearly exhausted, but she was afraid to leave the hospital even for short periods, terrified that something might happen to her son while she was away. As Margaret worked around Mrs. Santos, she made small adjustments to improve the woman's comfort. She ensured that the waiting area temperature was optimal, that magazines and tissues were readily available, and that the coffee station was fully stocked and clean. Margaret also made sure that Mrs. Santos had access to phone chargers and that the lighting in the waiting area was set to reduce eye strain and promote rest. Mrs. Santos looked up as Margaret cleaned around her area. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You've been so kind these past few days. I don't think I've properly introduced myself. I'm Patricia Santos." Margaret paused in her work and gave Mrs. Santos her full attention. "Margaret Shun," she replied. "How is your son doing today?" Mrs. Santos's face showed the mixture of hope and fear that Margaret had seen in thousands of family members over the years. "The doctors say he's stable, but still critical." They're cautiously optimistic, but her voice trailed off. Margaret understood the unfinished sentence. In the ICU, cautiously optimistic could change to devastating news in a matter of hours, and every family member lived with that uncertainty. "Would you like me to make sure someone checks on you regularly?" Margaret asked gently. Sometimes family members forget to take care of themselves while they're taking care of their loved ones. Mrs. Santos nodded gratefully. "I keep thinking I should go home for a few hours, get a proper shower, change clothes. But I'm afraid to leave. What if something happens while I'm gone?" Margaret considered this carefully. In her decades of observing families in crisis, she had learned that this fear was nearly universal and completely understandable. But she had also learned that exhausted, stressed family members were less able to provide support when their loved ones needed them most. "Mrs. Santos," Margaret said thoughtfully, "I work every day, and I'm here most of the time your son is here. If you'd like, I can check on him periodically when you're not here, and make sure someone contacts you immediately if there are any changes." This was not part of Margaret's official job description, and she was careful not to overstep her boundaries regarding medical information or patient care. But she could certainly observe whether there was unusual activity around a patient's room and ensure that family communication protocols were followed. Mrs. Santos looked at Margaret with surprise and gratitude. "You would do that? Really?" Margaret nodded simply. "It's important that you take care of yourself so you can be strong for your son. He's going to need you to be at your best when he starts recovering." This conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Kim, the young trauma surgery resident whom Margaret had helped months earlier. Dr. Kim was making rounds in the ICU and stopped to speak with Mrs. Santos about Miguel's condition. As Dr. Kim provided her update, Margaret quietly finished her work in the waiting area and moved on to her next assigned location. But she made a mental note to check on Mrs. Santos regularly and to ensure that the waiting area remained as comfortable as possible for the families who were spending long, stressful hours there. What Margaret did not know was that her interaction with Mrs. Santos had been observed by General Harrison, who was conducting his final tour of the hospital before the closing ceremony. The general had asked to visit the ICU as part of his comprehensive review, and he had witnessed Margaret's conversation with Mrs. Santos from a distance. General Harrison was struck by what he had seen. Margaret's offer to check on Mrs. Santos' son was not something that could be mandated by hospital policy or job descriptions. It was an act of genuine compassion that came from someone who understood the human cost of military service and was willing to provide support beyond her official responsibilities. Dr. Richardson, who was accompanying the general on his final tour, noticed his interest in Margaret's interaction. "General, that's the woman we were discussing earlier. Margaret Chun." General Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "I can see why she's made such an impression on people. What she just did for that family represents the best of what military medical care should be." As they continued through the ICU, General Harrison found himself thinking about the broader implications of Margaret's approach to her work. Military families made enormous sacrifices when their loved ones served in combat zones or dangerous training situations. When those family members found themselves in military medical facilities, they deserved to be treated with the same level of care and respect that their loved ones had earned through their service. Margaret Shin seemed to understand this intuitively. Her work was not just about maintaining clean facilities, but about creating an environment where military families could focus on healing and recovery rather than worrying about basic comfort and dignity. General Harrison's tour concluded in the hospital's administrative offices, where he met briefly with department heads to thank them for their time and to provide initial feedback about his observations. But his mind was increasingly focused on the closing ceremony and the recognition he planned to give Margaret Chun. The ceremony was scheduled to take place in Walter Reed's main auditorium at 5 o'clock. Hospital staff from all departments had been invited to attend, and the auditorium was expected to be full. General Harrison had originally planned to deliver remarks about the quality of care at Walter Reed and the dedication of the medical staff. But he had decided to expand his remarks to include something much more specific and personal. As 5 o'clock approached, staff members began gathering in the auditorium. Doctors, nurses, administrators, technicians, and support staff filled the seats, honored to hear from such a high-ranking military officer. Margaret Shin was not planning to attend the ceremony. Environmental services staff were not typically included in such events, and Margaret preferred to use the time when most other staff were attending the ceremony to complete additional cleaning work in the patient areas. But Mr. Rodriguez, Margaret's supervisor, had received specific instructions that Margaret needed to be present for the ceremony. The instructions had come directly from the hospital administrator's office, and they indicated that attendance was mandatory for all environmental services staff. Mr. Rodriguez found Margaret in the ICU, where she was taking advantage of the reduced foot traffic to perform some deeper cleaning tasks. "Margaret," he said, "you need to attend this ceremony in the auditorium. It's mandatory for all department staff." Margaret looked surprised. "I thought I could use this time to finish the deep cleaning rotation. Are you sure I need to be there?" Mr. Rodriguez nodded. The order came directly from Dr. Richardson's office. Everyone needs to be present. Margaret was puzzled by this requirement, but she had never been one to question official directives. She quickly finished her immediate tasks, secured her cleaning supplies, and made her way to the auditorium. By the time she arrived, most of the seats were filled, and she found a place in the back row, hoping to remain unobtrusive during the ceremony. General Harrison took the stage at exactly 5 o'clock, accompanied by Dr. Richardson and the hospital's senior leadership. The general's presence commanded immediate attention, and the auditorium became completely quiet as he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Harrison began, "I have spent today touring Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, and I want to begin by saying that the level of medical care provided here represents the finest military medical facility in the world." The audience applauded, clearly proud to hear such praise from such a high-ranking officer. General Harrison continued, The doctors, nurses, technicians, and administrators here have created an environment where wounded warriors receive not just medical treatment, but comprehensive care that addresses every aspect of their recovery and rehabilitation. He went on to praise specific departments and programs, highlighting innovations in trauma surgery, advances in prosthetic technology, and improvements in mental health services. The audience listened with pride and satisfaction as their work was recognized and praised. But then General Harrison's tone shifted slightly. However, he said, "During my visit today, I discovered something that exemplifies the best of what military medical care should be, and it came from a source that might surprise you." Margaret, sitting in the back row, continued to listen politely, assuming that the general was about to recognize one of the medical departments or perhaps a specific doctor or nurse who had made an exceptional contribution. Today, I had the privilege of observing the work of someone who embodies the values of service, excellence, and dedication that we seek to instill in every person who serves our military community, General Harrison continued. This individual has spent nearly 4 decades providing extraordinary service to wounded warriors and their families, service that goes far beyond any job description or official requirement. Margaret began to feel a slight sense of unease, though she could not identify why. Something about the general's words seemed to be heading in a direction she had not expected. General Harrison looked out over the audience, his eyes scanning the faces until he located Margaret in the back row. "Margaret Chun," he said clearly, "would you please stand?" Margaret felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Every head in the auditorium turned to look at her, and she realized with shock that she was the subject of General Harrison's remarks. Her first instinct was to remain seated and hope that there had been some mistake, but the general was looking directly at her, waiting. Slowly, with great reluctance, Margaret stood. The auditorium remained completely silent, and she could feel hundreds of eyes focused on her. This was exactly the kind of attention she had spent 37 years trying to avoid. General Harrison smiled warmly when he saw Margaret stand. "Margaret Chun has worked in environmental services at Walter Reed for 37 years, he continued. During that time, she has transformed what could be a routine job into something approaching an art form." Margaret remained standing, completely overwhelmed by the unexpected attention. She could see people throughout the auditorium turning to look at her with curiosity and interest, many of them clearly trying to place who she was. General Harrison began describing what he had observed during his day at the hospital. Margaret's extraordinary attention to detail, her proactive care for patients and families, her ability to create healing environments that went far beyond basic cleanliness. He spoke about her interaction with Staff Sergeant Kumar, her care for Mrs. Santos, and the countless other examples of service that had been described to him throughout the day. As the general continued speaking, Margaret felt a mixture of pride, embarrassment, and bewilderment. She had never imagined that her work was being noticed at such a high level, and she was completely unprepared for this level of public recognition. But General Harrison was not finished. He was about to do something that would surprise everyone in the auditorium, including Margaret herself. The auditorium remained completely silent as General Harrison continued his remarks about Margaret Chun. Margaret stood in the back row, still processing the shock of being singled out for recognition in front of the entire hospital staff. She could feel her heart beating rapidly, and she was fighting the urge to sit back down and disappear into the crowd. "Throughout my military career," General Harrison continued, "I have learned that the most important contributions to our mission often come from people who never seek recognition for their service. Margaret Chun represents the best example of this principle that I have ever encountered." The general paused and looked directly at Margaret. "Mrs. Chun, would you please join me on the stage?" Margaret felt a wave of panic. Being recognized from her seat was overwhelming enough, but being asked to come to the stage in front of hundreds of people was far beyond anything she was prepared for. She looked around, hoping that somehow the general might be addressing someone else, but it was clear that all attention was focused on her. Dr. Richardson stepped forward from his position near the stage and began walking toward Margaret, clearly intending to escort her to the front of the auditorium. Margaret realized that she had no choice but to comply with the general's request, despite her intense discomfort with the situation. As Margaret made her way down the aisle toward the stage, she could hear quiet conversations and murmurs from the audience. Many of the medical staff were clearly trying to place her, and she could hear people saying things like, "Oh, that's Margaret from Environmental Services, and she's the one who always makes sure everything is perfect." When Margaret reached the stage, General Harrison stepped down from the podium to greet her personally. The contrast between the four-star general in his formal military dress uniform and Margaret in her simple work scrubs was striking, but General Harrison's manner was warm and respectful. "Mrs. Chun," General Harrison said, speaking loud enough for the audience to hear, "thank you for joining me. I want to share with everyone here what I learned about your service today." General Harrison then did something that surprised everyone in the auditorium, including Margaret herself. He turned to face her directly and rendered a formal military salute. The symbolism of this moment was extraordinary. A four-star general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military, was saluting a civilian member of the Environmental Services staff. In military protocol, salutes are typically rendered to superior officers or as a sign of respect to fallen comrades and honored veterans. For General Harrison to salute Margaret was a powerful statement about the value he placed on her service. Margaret was completely overwhelmed by this gesture. She had no idea how to respond to a salute from a general, and she stood there for a moment looking uncertain and emotional. General Harrison maintained his salute for several seconds, ensuring that everyone in the audience understood the significance of the moment. Then he lowered his hand and began to speak again. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Harrison said, "Margaret Chun has spent 37 years in service to our wounded warriors. She has provided this service without seeking recognition, without asking for promotions or awards, and without ever failing to meet the highest standards of excellence." The general went on to describe specific examples of Margaret's work that he had observed and learned about during his visit. He spoke about her interaction with Staff Sergeant Kumar and how she had helped prepare him for their meeting. He described her care for Mrs. Santos and her willingness to provide support beyond her official job responsibilities. He mentioned the numerous commendation letters in her personnel file and the consistent praise from medical staff about her impact on patient care. "But what makes Margaret Chun truly exceptional," General Harrison continued, "is not just the quality of her work, but her understanding of what service really means. She has recognized that her role in military medical care is not just about cleaning facilities, but about creating an environment where healing can occur, where families can find comfort during their darkest hours, and where wounded warriors can maintain their dignity during their recovery." Margaret listened to these words with amazement. She had never thought of her work in such broad terms, and hearing her daily activities described as having such importance was both humbling and moving. General Harrison then announced something that shocked everyone, including Margaret. "Mrs. Chun, on behalf of the United States Army Medical Command, I want to present you with the Civilian Service Achievement Medal in recognition of your extraordinary dedication to the care of military personnel and their families." Margaret looked at the general with complete surprise. She had no idea that such awards existed, much less that she might be eligible for one. The Civilian Service Achievement Medal was a significant honor, typically reserved for civilian employees who made exceptional contributions to military missions. Dr. Richardson stepped forward with a medal case, and General Harrison opened it to reveal the medal and its accompanying ribbon. The ceremony of presenting military awards followed specific protocols, and General Harrison conducted the presentation with full military formality. As the medal was pinned to Margaret's scrubs, she found herself fighting back tears. After 37 years of quiet service, she was receiving recognition that exceeded anything she had ever imagined possible. The weight of the medal on her uniform felt symbolic of the weight of responsibility she had carried every day in her work. But General Harrison was not finished with the ceremony. He had one more surprise for Margaret and for the audience. "Mrs. Chun," General Harrison said, "there is one more thing I would like to do to honor your service." The general turned to address the entire auditorium. "I want everyone here to understand something important about what we do in military medicine. We often focus on the dramatic interventions, the surgical procedures, the advanced technology that saves lives on the battlefield and in our hospitals. These things are critically important, and the medical professionals here represent the finest in the world." He paused for emphasis. "But healing happens in an environment, not just in an operating room. Recovery occurs in a context, not just during medical procedures. The difference between a patient who recovers quickly and completely and one who struggles with complications often comes down to factors that we might consider small or routine." General Harrison gestured toward Margaret. "Margaret Chun has mastered these factors that we might consider small or routine. She has understood that dignity, comfort, cleanliness, organization, and genuine human care are not secondary considerations in medical treatment. They are essential components of healing." The general then made an announcement that surprised everyone, including the hospital administration. "Effective immediately, I am recommending that Walter Reed National Military Medical Center establish the Margaret Chin Excellence in Environmental Services program. This program will use Mrs. Chin's methods and approaches as the standard for environmental services throughout military medical facilities." The audience erupted in applause. Margaret looked around with amazement, trying to process the idea that her individual approach to her work was being considered as a model for implementation across the entire military medical system. General Harrison continued, "Mrs. Chun will work with our medical command headquarters to develop training programs, standard operating procedures, and evaluation criteria based on her 37 years of experience and excellence. Her methods will be studied, documented, and implemented in military medical facilities around the world." Margaret realized that her life was about to change in ways she had never anticipated. Not only was she receiving recognition for her work, but she was being asked to take on leadership responsibilities that would affect the care provided to military personnel globally. Dr. Richardson stepped forward to address the audience. "We are honored to have Margaret Chun as a member of our Walter Reed family," he said. "Her recognition today represents the best of what our hospital strives to achieve. Excellence in every aspect of care, from the most advanced medical procedures to the most basic human dignity." As the ceremony concluded, General Harrison shook Margaret's hand warmly and spoke to her quietly. "Mrs. Chun," he said, "you have spent your career serving others without seeking recognition. But your example needs to be shared so that other people can learn from what you have accomplished. Are you willing to take on this new challenge?" Margaret looked at the general with the same thoughtful expression she brought to every decision in her work. After a moment, she nodded. "If it will help provide better care for our military personnel and their families, then yes, I'm willing." The audience rose in a standing ovation as Margaret made her way back to her seat. But the applause continued for several minutes, with medical staff throughout the auditorium showing their appreciation for someone who had worked among them for decades, while making contributions that many of them had never fully recognized. As Margaret sat back down, she was approached by dozens of colleagues who wanted to congratulate her and express their appreciation for her work. Dr. Kim, the trauma surgery resident, made her way through the crowd to thank Margaret personally for the help she had provided months earlier. Staff Sergeant Kumar, who had been brought to the ceremony in a wheelchair, waited in line to shake Margaret's hand and tell her how much her care had meant to his recovery. Mrs. Santos, who had been notified about the ceremony and had come down from the ICU waiting area, approached Margaret with tears in her eyes. "I had no idea," she said. "I knew you were special, but I had no idea that what you did for me was part of something so much bigger." Margaret accepted these congratulations graciously, but she was clearly overwhelmed by the attention. After 37 years of working quietly in the background, becoming the center of attention at a major hospital ceremony was a dramatic change. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's life changed significantly. She began working with Military Medical Command headquarters to document her approaches and develop training materials. She traveled to other military medical facilities to observe their environmental services operations and to provide guidance for improvement. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret discovered that her recognition had inspired other support staff throughout the military medical system to approach their work with greater understanding of its importance and impact. Environmental services staff, food service workers, administrative personnel, and others began to see their roles not just as jobs to be completed, but as essential components of the healing environment for wounded warriors and their families. The Margaret Chin Excellence in Environmental Services program became a model for military medical facilities around the world. Her methods were studied, adapted, and implemented in hospitals throughout the military medical system. Training programs were developed based on her approaches, and evaluation criteria were established that emphasized not just technical competence, but understanding of the human impact of environmental services work. Margaret continued to work at Walter Reed, but her role expanded to include training and mentoring responsibilities. She found great satisfaction in helping other environmental services staff understand how their work could have profound impact on patient care and family experiences. Years later, when Margaret finally retired after more than 4 decades of service, she was recognized not just as an exceptional employee, but as someone who had fundamentally changed how the military medical system understood the role of environmental services in patient care. Her approach had influenced thousands of staff members and improved the experiences of countless patients and families. The quiet woman who had spent her career trying to remain invisible had become a model for excellence whose influence extended far beyond the floor she had cleaned for so many years. Margaret Chin had proven that extraordinary service comes not from seeking recognition, but from understanding that every job, no matter how routine it might seem, represents an opportunity to serve others and make a meaningful difference in their lives. General Harrison's decision to recognize Margaret's service had honored not just her individual contributions, but the principle that every person who serves the military mission, regardless of their role or rank, deserves respect and appreciation for their dedication to something larger than themselves.